a change from the ambassadors to someone who led an ordinary life, but ended up in an extraordinary situation of being an enemy alien in the First World War. And over the last 3 or 4 years, I've become quite attached to him. So here he is, and I put that quotation up at the bottom last night when I was thinking about it. In the diary, which I'm going to talk about, he says, really, it is very trying now, nearly 4 years, to be shut up in this place. Cannot go to Smyrna to see anyone, nor can they come up from Smyrna to see us. Sometimes for days I don't see a man. And so the story really is about those 4 years when he spent living outside Smyrna, really waiting for the war to end, I suppose. Now, I've always been fascinated by the impact of great events on ordinary people. Maybe it's because I was taught sociology by one of the pioneers of mass observation. We were always taught that real history was from what it did to people, not the politics. I'm not sure that's right, but that was what he taught us. And this is really what Spencer Whiteman's diary is all about. It's all about his life day by day, and each entry records what was of importance, concern or irritation to not just a grumpy man, but a feisty and at quite times despairing elderly man as he just sat out the war in his factory some 35 miles outside Smyrna. Now, when I was a child, oops, is it this one? No, it's not going. No, it's not moving. Never been good at technology. Here, I'll do it with the... Ah. There it is.
That's it. And then if you want to go back, it's that little
Right,
button.
fine. So when I was a child, my grandmother, Maud Williamson Nee Whiteman, here she is around the time of the First World War, maybe about the time of her marriage, I'm not sure, used to entertain her granddaughters with tales about her childhood in Menemen in the last decades of the 19th century. So we heard about my father's factory with a wall round it on which she and her brothers sat and stole melons from passing camel trains. We heard about outings with a factory foreman to watch the dervishes, but we had no idea what dervishes were, but that didn't seem to matter too much. And we were told that Granny and her 2 brothers would go down by train to Smyrna on Mondays and come home on Fridays as they had to go to school and they stayed with their grandparents, but that they were tied into the railway carriage because the 3 children had quite a reputation and the staff were apprehensive about the consequences if they let the railway superintendent's children fall out. So apart from the stories, the only information that she ever said about Spencer Whiteman, and she was a great lady for one-liners and would never explain anything else, was that she once said, all my father's family were smugglers and sheep stealers and came from the Kent and Sussex area. And by the time we were old enough and interested enough to ask her what she was really talking about and what this was all about, she was no longer with us. And sadly, my mother, although she'd been born in Smyrna, had spent her early years in Italy, and she'd not known her grandfather, and she had no memory of the factory. She knew little about his background, how he came to Menemen, or what he did, really, other than that she thought he processed cotton. But she did know that he came from Udimore, a village in West Sussex, and she knew that because one of her cousins, a 3rd-generation expatriate, had had to prove his British ancestry, and she and my father had turned up some baptism records in the parish church. Now, after her death, we found, in addition to a couple of photographs of Spencer Whiteman, this very tatty folder, in which was, as you can see, extremely tatty, and it's now one of the problems with it. Inside of which were these sheets of paper, which are 2 diaries kept from 1915 until just a few weeks before his death in April 1919. Initially, he records the facts of what's happening to himself and his property, But in mid-1916, he begins a letter which he hoped would reach his children if the worst happened and he didn't survive the war. And this much more details his day-to-day life during the 4 years when he didn't leave his house and gardens. Now, there are some problems with these documents. First of all, the paper's deteriorating fast, and if you touch it, it's falling to pieces, and bits have fallen off, which makes it even harder to read. But this is a plug for the county museum services of this country, that a very kind archivist is going to help me try and stabilise it, because at the moment I don't really want to touch it anymore, which is a shame. When you try to transcribe it, he doesn't give you any context for the entry. So he'll say things like, new soldiers came, some soldiers went, and you think, well, what soldiers? Where were they going? And he doesn't really tell you that too often. Now, the other thing is his spelling and punctuation are idiosyncratic and inconsistent. He doesn't finish sentences, and then just to cap it all, he uses Greek and Turkish words and place names, which he spells inconsistently, and I think he's spelling them phonetically. So one job to do is to try and work out sometimes where the places are that he's actually talking about. And they'll be quite different. You'll have words that he starts with a B and then starts with a P, and I think they're the same word, but I'm not sure. So what I propose to do is briefly describe to you what's known about his background, try and give a feeling of the situation in Menemen around 1914 to 15 when he starts, and then to give you a glimpse of some of the themes and incidents he describes. Now, the next problem with Spencer Whiteman is that when you're researching the history of very ordinary people, unless they were literate, they owned property or fell foul of the law, they leave a very light footprint on history. But starting with these few facts, we can put together quite a picture of his life. Now, he came from a large extended family, mainly agricultural labourers, living in and around Rye and Winchelsea in Sussex in the 18th and 19th century. And in this area, which borders the south coast, as you would know, smuggling was a major industry. And large numbers of the local impoverished working classes were actually very heavily involved in smuggling, and they were used to make sure they got the cargoes off the beaches as quickly as possible. And there are references in the late 18th century to the Whitemans running with the Hawkhurst gang, who, from what I've discovered, were the craze of their generation. And he also has an uncle, also Spencer Whiteman, who was transported in 1928 after he pleaded guilty to being involved in the last great battle between the revenue men and the smugglers, where they actually managed to kill someone. So he's not exactly, this wasn't a family to whom crime was not known. We know that he was baptised in 1840 in this little church in the hamlet of Udimore. And from the census of the following year, we can see that he was one of the, well, you can't see it from there because a couple of children were born after the 1840 census. He was one of the 6 children of Edward and Rosina Whiteman, and that his father was an agricultural labourer. What's more interesting is, and that's thanks to my grandson who showed me how to do that last week, and I'm very proud of it, that actually says Old Workhouse. And throughout Edward Whiteman's life, that address crops up, and he was obviously not always as affluent as even the poorest labourer. When we come to 1851, he's here again, just here, and now he's 10, and he's already left school and he's working as an agricultural labourer, which may explain the spelling. If we move on, by the time we come to the next census, his father has now become an innkeeper, and this rather nice house was in 1860 a pub in Winchelsea. Winchelsea is also a smuggling centre, so yes. Interestingly, in the house at the time, Spencer is now living there, and you can see him just here, and he is now described as a millwright. Now, whether he got an apprenticeship or not, I don't know, but for the rest of his life, he describes himself as a millwright. Also, in the house is a lady called Ellen Huggett, and at the end of 1861, he and Ellen marry. Over the next few years they have 2 children, Nellie and Anna Rosa, and sometime between Anna Rosa being born in Rye in 1864 and dying in Smyrna and being buried in the cemetery at Bucha, the family obviously went to Smyrna. I have no idea what made a millwright from Rye get up one morning and decide to take his wife and children to Smyrna. But he went, and from an entry in the diary, you could work out he must have been in Menemen from about 1867 onwards at the mill. How or why, it's just a big mystery, and I have fantasies in the dark hours of the night about how I might find out what made him go, but I don't think I ever will. Other children were born, 3 more children were born and died in Menemen before Ellen died in 1878 in childbirth and was buried with her daughter in the Anglican cemetery at Bucha next to Anna Rosa. A year later, Spencer Whiteman remarried, and he remarried Mary Harriet Peacock. Now, she could only have been a couple of years older than the one surviving child from the first marriage. And his daughter Nellie is someone no one had ever mentioned in the family. And I really only discovered Nellie when he mentions her in the diary. But Nellie grew up, married, was exactly the same way as Mary Peacock, who was 19 when he married her. The interesting thing is that on his marriage certificates, he's now decided that his father, Edward, is a farmer. I suspect that he was going up in the world, he'd become quite successful, and he was marrying into quite a successful middle-class family, and it was probably a bit better to have a farmer as your father than an agricultural labourer. I wouldn't like to castigate him, but I think that's what he did. It happened quite often when you look at it. In the following year, my grandmother was born, shortly followed by her 2 brothers, Francis and Spencer. Now, this slide actually shows Spencer Whiteman with his in-laws, basically, in about 1890. He's this gentleman here with the fine whiskers. Mary Harriet is beside him. His father-in-law, Francis Peacock, of the railway, and his wife, and Mary's brother James. My granny's in the front. And for those of you that remember Edward de Jong, I think that one of those 2 little girls is his mother, because that's certainly his grandmother, Evelyn de Jong, who married James Whiteman. But I'm not quite sure. That's certainly my granny. She said it was her, so we must believe her. The man at the back is the family mystery. He's called James. He was called Uncle Ralph by my grandmother and my mother. We cannot find who Uncle Ralph is. There doesn't seem to be anyone who could be Uncle Ralph. But he must have existed because I've got some of his silver on my sideboard at the moment. But that is just one of the many mysteries about family history, isn't it? So where were they all at the start of the war? Well, old Mr. Peacock has died. My grandmother has grown up and married, and she's living in Italy with her husband and my mother. The 2 sons of Spencer's 2 sons, Frank and Spencer, they're in Egypt, where one of them has a commission in the Royal Engineers shortly after the war, and we don't know what the other one did. And old Mrs. Peacock is living with Spencer and Mary at the mill in Menemen, and more of that later. James Peacock is also in Smyrna. And Nellie, who's not there because Nellie is sort of not part of this family, I suppose, she was also now married and living in Smyrna. So in 1915, the Whitemans seemed to be, from the diary, living in a largish house next to the factory, which was beside one of the roads leading into Menemen. They had a garden, and somewhere in the area Spencer has land on which he's got vines, he's got almond trees and olives, and he also talks about my fields. And he also has a hen house, which causes me some mystery, because the hen house is large enough for the troops to want to put their bullocks in, and they try to commandeer it. And how big a hen house does one need, I'm tempted to ask, and put the bullocks in? The factory seems to have been a collection of buildings, some made of stone and some of brick, with either tiled or zinc roofs. I mean, it's a very Victorian sort of factory, a load of old sheds, really, I suppose. He talks about his old mill, his new mill, the cottonseed and gin rooms, the engine house, the magazines, which were storage areas, and the stables. And I think there was a big workshop there as well where he made things. He also complains that the Turkish troops steal his Cormac reaping machine, which apparently was a sort of ubiquitous Victorian piece of agricultural equipment. And he had a plough there too that got damaged. But what he was reaping and sowing is yet another mystery. He was running his factory on petroleum engines, and whatever he was processing, he needed water because there is a dispute mentioned about how much water he can have. But even in the war, he's really interested in engineering and what's happening. He was an engineer through and through. And he becomes interested when he hears how someone else is managing to run a mill on anthracite when they can't get petroleum anymore. And I think that he hopes at the end of the war he might do the same. So he was always maintained his interest. So what was Menemen like from what we know? Well, many of you will know more about the politics and the military history of the First World War than me, but certainly until 1914, Menemen had a mixed population of about 20,000 of Greeks and Turks. And in the second half of 1914, many Greeks and Turks the Turks and Greeks, there were some very violent situations, I think we can say, between them. And there was certainly a lot of violence and a lot of death. And many Greeks actually moved into the town. Now, what I've read are called Turkish irregulars, with a caveat that were they irregulars and what was the actual relationship to officialdom. They didn't attack Menemen, but if Greeks were seen to leave, they were actually shot. So they had seen some pretty horrific things leading up to the war. And so they were well aware of what could happen to aliens with either the covert or the overt or covert support of the Turkish governments. By 1915, Menemen already has a large number of troops based in the town and in transit through it because it was on a direct route to and from the Dardanelles. And an Australian intelligence report from 1915 estimates there were 10,000 troops in the Smyrna area. And in June 1917, he hears that in one period 18,000 have passed through Menemen, presumably en route to the front, but only 3,000 to 4,000 ever came back. He can hear cannon, and throughout the war he can hear the cannons firing. How far up towards the Dardanelles is not clear, and planes from both sides are flying over. And he at one point says, the first aeroplane I ever saw came over and threw its bombs out. He records bombings in Menemen and also occasions when aircrafts are actually shot down, or they just break down and fall, as he calls it, break down and fall out of the sky. In March 1916, some large pieces of shrapnel fall on his land, so he brings them home. I don't know why he brought them home. He records bridges being built to accommodate military traffic, and some of the damage done to his property is so that building materials can be salvaged from it to build a hospital, presumably for the wounded soldiers. There are troops camped in the fields and vineyards of the residents, and that includes his property, and his factories being used to billet soldiers. In addition, they use his buildings to store supplies, stable horses, mules, camels and bullocks, and on occasion they bring in heavy artillery to hide it from the enemy. And at one point he records the arrival of some very large Austrian cannon, which he calls the 32s, and drawn by motor transport. Now I assume that he was not unique in having his property taken over by the Turkish government. I think probably much property was taken over for whatever they wanted to take it over, and the Turkish government had formally declared that Greek property could be seized by troops when necessary. In June 1916, he summed up the situation, so you can see we are in the thick of it. On the day-to-day basis, the war made life hard for all the residents. Food prices rise, and they supplement what they can by their own produce, eggs and stores of olive and olive oil. But wheat flour quickly becomes unobtainable. And interestingly, if you read Grace Williamson's diary, she records the same thing, that they actually have to revert to barley flour. And in addition, he tells us that many local mills aren't working. Now, I suspect they were Greek-owned, so they'd shut down in the same way as... And in 1916, Turkish villagers can't get their corn ground. So they come to him, and I'll talk about that a bit later. And funny things, he gets worried about matches. He can't get matches, so they only use 3 matches a day. And also things are getting so short in the war that timber, spare parts, bits for machinery just can't be found, and there's a ready market for them if you can get hold of them. And in the latter part of the war, he's asked by the authorities if he's got any timber to sell, so that they can pay cash for it. So that's what the situation was. When he starts the diary in March 1915, his factory was still working, but I think it was in some way under the supervision of the authorities. And some parts of the premises were already being used for troops and storage purposes, but he was able to lock some things away, and he had the key, so he was partly in control of the factory. And throughout the war, he treads a very careful line. He owns the factory, but he's always fearful he's going to be dispossessed and evicted, and he can see that that could happen, and I'll come to it later, an occasion when he nearly is moved out of it. So on one hand, he fights to remain there and minimise all the damage and destruction that's going on to his property, but on the other, he tends to say that it's not up to him to make any decisions about it, and refers people to either the local or the military authorities if they want anything from the factory. So in June 16, the Turkish villagers come to him and say, will he restart his mill, as there's not enough mills working to grind the corn, and they propose a partnership. They say that he will run it, but they will be the sort of titular owners, so it will be a Turkish firm, and they will get the civil authorities to get the soldiers out. And he says, I'm not playing that game, not unless I get formal confirmation from the civil authorities that this is going to last, because the next lot of troops that come in, the military will say, well, I'm not having that, you know, we want your mill. And there seems to be a tension throughout the war between his good relations with the civil authorities and what the troops are doing. But in March, he's called to the Connacht as the governor wishes to see him. Once there, he's left to kick his heels for some hours with no other information than that he'll probably be taken to Smyrna that day. After some time, Mary, who comes out as quite feisty too, she arrives, demands to see the governor, and Spencer goes home with a gendarme to guard him. He's allowed, he eats, he collects some clothes, and then he reports to the railway station. That evening, he says, in the company of 2 Jews and a Russian and 1 a Frenchman, don't know whether that's 4 people or 2 people, he travels to Smyrna, where after giving his personal details at the Connacht, we were told that whoever wished to go to a hotel to sleep and would pay all expenses from his own pocket would be allowed to do so, with a policeman to watch us and not to go out of the place from our room. 5 days later, they were given our freedom to go where they liked. So he goes back to Smyrna, but from that point onwards, he doesn't leave his property. He says he's worried he'll be accused of spying if he's out and about too much. And from then on, his loneliness and isolation become quite a regular topic. Mary still goes out, she visits friends and goes to a couple market, and a couple of times she gets a pass to go to Smyrna, but he actually doesn't leave the walls. So, although he gets news by letter from Smyrna, they seem to be able to get an internal post. Letters have to be sent open, and he says it's dangerous to say anything about the politics, and he can't contact his family outside, so he knows nothing about what's happened to his family. He says his last English newspaper was the Daily Mail in October 1914. From then on, he can read heavily censored Greek newspapers, which come from Smyrna, and the Turkish press. But he also has conversations with Turkish officers, and there's the gossip that Mary picks up as she's out and about. So he does record what he thinks is happening in the war, but he really doesn't know whether he's got it right. He just says, we hear rumours. We hear there has been a big battle at Verdun. We hear this, that and the other. But he's never sure what's happening. He continues to run the factory until June, when he says that the factory stopped working, no petroleum to be found. The last tin I bought, I paid, it looks like 3 midgets and 6 piastres. Good money. I'm not sure what midgets are. And then he starts to catalogue the damage to his property, not just by the troops in the factory, but all the troops round about. So first of all, the troops as they come in adapt everything. They knock holes in walls, they use things for the wrong purposes, they break things up, they make doors wider so they can get cannons inside. They just to make it fit for their purpose. Later in the war, floors collapse because they store too much bran and horse feed. It seems like they're storing on the first floor. They store too much. Other troops have stolen the beams and the props that support the floor, so the whole lot comes down. Outside, they cut down his trees and branches to camouflage things they want to hide. And then they turn their animals out into his vineyards and his orchards, and they start eating the trees. Secondly, coming through, he seems to have what he calls the Tabor, which seem to be sort of logistics convoys and teams, and they're building things. And they have carpenters and blacksmiths with them who take anything they need, bits of steel bars, floorboards, they take them to mend their own equipment. And so they just take what they want. Unfortunately, they take the roof tiles off so they can get at the roof timbers. And then, of course, rain gets in and gullies are blocked, buildings flood in heaven lane, and eventually some of his buildings actually just collapse. They just collapse. And then thirdly, the troops are obviously living off the land, the Turkish troops. They are scavenging for food, for firewood. They take windows, they take door frames to burn, and they take doors to use as beds. Now, this seems to me very odd, but apparently they did. Many of his trees, his almonds and his olives, end up as firewoods. And then to his fury, they cut his green grapes, eat them, and steal his chickens. And finally, the soldiers begin to break into the locked areas of the factory and steal whatever they think they can sell. Now, when he complains to the officers, initially some efforts are made to return the goods, but as time goes on, the officers just shrug their shoulders and say they can do nothing as the soldiers are hungry, cold and wet. And at the end of the war, he says that the remaining buildings are just shells, and he says all is destroyed. So it is really a wreck by the end of the war. But other things happen in the family, in the factory. There's an outbreak of cholera in the town, and they use the factory as a quarantine station for the contacts and burning the clothes of the victims. They bring in a German cleansing station because the soldiers are covered in lice, and at some time there's a doctor treating the wounded there. So it's really being used as a military station. So maybe it was some comfort when in December 1915, he was informed that whilst he had to pay taxes for the house I live in, also for olive trees, vineyards, fields, etc., the factory was not included. So he's still being taxed. He tells very little about the soldiers, but he does say an odd bit, really. Quite sadly, in June 1916, we've now got some soldiers come from Constantinople, and some say come from the Dardanelles. They have tents, they say English left behind, quite new, and the men say are much nicer than their own. They also have some very large mules, the English left behind. So they're actually now picking up what's left over after the English are having a bad time. They also, once or twice, he comments sympathetically on the poor state the soldiers are in. And he says that one lot moved on, and they don't have any boots. He's also quite friendly with them. It's all quite surreal sometimes. The colonel of the regiment came in for a chat, and they discussed the war and the rights and wrongs of war in general. And then last night some officer was promoted and came to ask Mary if we had a room in our house we could let them have for one night to give a dinner. She told them they could have it in our yard under the mulberry tree, and she would have tables, chairs, plates, etc., or anything to assist them. Their man cook and Mary and Angelico, who seems to be a sort of factotum, help them. He also notices that they have English cutlery, which they found at the Dardanelles, and donkey carts, which they say they'd also got from the English. But in June 1916, things, I think, get nastier because of the bombing of Smyrna. He hears about it, and he hears that the English men have all been rounded up. And he starts a second document, which he addresses to his 3 children abroad, which he says he's going to leave with his papers, should the worst happen, in the hopes it will reach them somehow. He says, "Dear Maud, Frank and Spence, things are looking so serious these days in Smyrna, we cannot tell from one day to another what may happen to any of us in this country. So I take this opportunity, if it should be my kismet never to see any of you again, to give my blessing to all 3 of you and your wives and husband, also the dear little children." And he then goes on to ask them to forgive him for wrongs, and it's quite sad. He says, 3 or 4 days ago, the English aeroplanes came over Smyrna before daylight and threw, they say, some 40 bombs, which fell on poor people's private houses. I don't think he'd have minded if they'd bombed the railway station, but they hit poor people's private houses and killed some 15 or 20 persons and wounded, they say, 30 or more. First report was they were going to hang 1 man for every 1 killed. And I think at this point he's really getting very worried. And he's also heard a rumour that the British are going to return and burn Smyrna. He actually can't see any point in bombing. He says the government won't take any notice. The Turkish government aren't going to be worried if you bomb Smyrna. He said, I don't know why they're bothering to do it. I paraphrase a bit. He also learns that his daughter Nellie's husband has been arrested with other men, and eventually he's taken with 26 other people to an internment camp near the Black Sea, where he dies of pneumonia in August 1918. So all in all, I think by this time he's very worried. Having seen what happened to his Greek neighbours a couple of years beforehand, he's getting quite worried. And he's always anxious about their future. How long will it be before they finally get turned out? He says initially he's not been molested, but he's subject to increasing harassment from the soldiers should he complain about damage. He says on one occasion his men are turned away when they go to gather some grapes from his fields and are told that everything is the property of Turkey now. And after an altercation about damage to the factory, an officer told me I had no business to go into the place, as nothing belonged to me. It all belonged to the Turkish government, and I had better go to London or wherever I liked. And eventually he stops even going into the factory, even though officially he still has the keys and some areas are locked and supposed to be under his control. He says, my wife says I had better stop away, as I might get thrashed if I interfere, and being an old man, I'm weak, and so I have kept away. His men keep an eye on things after that, and he works with them to try and minimise the damage. But in 1917, his watchman is told to leave his accommodation and booted out to go and live in the town. In October 1917, and this is why I really grew to like him a lot, he's told that he has to leave his house in 2 days and that a house has been found for him to rent in the town. Well, he's not having that. He argues this has been his home for 52 years and he has all his possessions and those of his mother-in-law. Now, he has a lot of trouble with his mother-in-law, and I'll say something about her in a bit, and things they've rescued from the factory. So the officials say, well, you can lock them up in the factory and they'll be safe. So he says, you go in the factory and have a look and see what, but that's not worth anything. So he makes them an offer, all in one of his long sentences, so he makes an offer of 2 upstairs rooms, 1 part of the house, as there is only 1 pair of stairs to my house. My family and the soldiers could not live together. I offered to put stairs up to one of the windows, cut the window down to the floor and put up a door there so that we should be quite separated. After pros and cons, he would not accept that part of the house I offered. He proposed me to give him 2 rooms in the other part of the house. I agreed, so we put the stairs to one of those windows and they allowed 2 days to get out of the rooms. So the next day we emptied them and delivered. So I hope they will not demand any other part of the house. Every few days there is something, and every new lot of soldiers wants something fresh. So he just finds a way out of it, and he continues to live in the remaining bedrooms and the downstairs part of it. When an officer then asks for another room for himself, Spencer does get support, and the officer's told by the authorities that if he wants to have a private bedroom, he'll have to go to the town and rent one. So, if this demonstrates his feisty doggedness, he gets very grumpy when he comes to his mother-in-law. Oh, sorry, I haven't bothered to show you these because they're issues. I show you, I can't get there. Never mind, leave it. She's a fierce old lady. I wouldn't want to have crossed old Mrs. Peacock. She's a battle axe to end all of them, if she's like a photograph. But in December 1917, there's another worrying rumour. We have just got news they're not going to pay us any more funds here, but that those that cannot live without assistance have to leave Smyrna. But those that are not in need can stop here in the country, but I do not know particulars. Mary is gone to Smyrna to see what it is. Now, Mary can't actually get to Smyrna by the train. She can't get permission to travel on the railway, so she goes on some circuitous route by cart and eventually gets to Smyrna, and then she's ill. When she had been in Smyrna 3 days, she became ill. We have passed both Christmas and also the New Year, but yet she has not come or wrote and told me anything about the English going away. It is very trying for me to be left in ignorance what we have to go through. And she has left her mother on my hands, and somehow we do not get on so well together as we might do. She wants everything just as she has been used to, which I tell her is impossible now in wartime. I think old Mrs. Peacock was quite a trial to him. So I just have this image of these two elderly people in a state of standoff, poor Mary unwell in Turkey. Mary does come home. The other thing that he's very cross about is that Mary's brother in Smyrna says he can't possibly look after old Mrs. Peacock. The fact she's wearing Mary out, well, you know, Mary looks after her much better than his wife ever could do. In any case, the house is too small. And as an old social worker who worked with elderly people, I thought, I've heard that over and over again. During 1918, she becomes frailer and is increasingly ill in bed, and she dies in December 1918. And what I find very moving as a family history document is that he describes both her death and her funeral. And I think there's not very often that you can actually find the funeral of your twice great-grandmother recorded. She says that the funeral took place the following day in the rain, and that he was the only relation she had to see her put into her last resting place, and that the procession went from the house to the Greek Orthodox churchyard along roads full of mud. I find that just really quite telling. They didn't leave her in that churchyard because actually there's a grave. She's got a grave in the churchyard in Bucha. Now I suspect that later, after when things were easier, they moved her to the Anglican churchyard. Now, he's just a couple of insights about what he did all day. And he says, last year, he says to his children, well, you must be wondering what I do. So she says, last year the soldiers caught a swarm of bees, and we had one before that settled in the lath and plaster of our house. So we made 2 box hives and put them in our garden. After a time, what should occur? Some hornets had found them and were catching them and carrying them away. And here comes the engineer. Well, I got some machine wire with small holes and put in front, thinking the hornets could not get through. However, they waited on the wire outside and caught the bees then, hundreds of them. So I set 2 with a flat broom and waited there day by day and killed as many as 200 and 300 a day. So gradually I got the best of them. But they had played havoc with the bees also. But it was pastime for me at the same time. But after all, I only got 4 or 5 pounds of honey. But it was good. And then he says, my work is to find wood and cut it up for the stove, water the garden, and if I have water, feed the chicken, collect eggs, etc. Several times he reports rumours that peace is coming, that flags come out, and this is from 1917 onwards. Flags come out, the Turks get really very excited, peace is on its way, and then it just fades away. And he also notes as the war goes through that the sort of major festivals are still being celebrated, but they're actually being celebrated much more quietly, and that there's not so much joy and happiness going on. But by August the 19th, he's quite hopeful, and he's been to talk about compensation for his losses. And in August, Mary's brother James arrives, having got a permit to travel. He says goodbye, and he hopes to leave for England as part of an exchange with prisoners of war that are being brought back to Turkey. Whether that happens, I don't think it does, because I think in the end he goes to Egypt. The war sort of passes, the end of the war, he doesn't sort of note that it's formally ended, but in January 1919, he writes they had really hoped things would be cleared up, but nothing has happened. He's been promised he will get damages in full, either from the Turkish government or the consulate. I have no idea who made this promise to him, but nothing is happening. Then he says, the Greek subjects here feel confident the Greek government will have Smyrna and district, but the Turks would much prefer the English to anybody else. But they say, we would rather have, this is the Turks, we would rather have any nation than the Greeks, as the Greeks hate them. And we can see why, given what we know about what was happening before the war, and certainly what happened afterwards. Soldiers stay in his factory until the end of the March 19, and somehow 100 camels arrive. And they've got to be sold, but they're still there in March, so I don't know what happened to the camels. And what pleases him is he starts to get letters with news of his children, including the grandchildren born during the war. And he grumbles that whilst Maud has 2 children, Frank 3, Spencer has only 1. And he says, what is he doing that he cannot add another one to his name? I don't think if ever Spencer got to see that, he'd have been too pleased. And his final entry is on March the 27th, 1919, when he records that Mary has been to Smyrna and brought up a pile of newspapers. He reports also that he hears that if they turn this part over to the Greeks, they, the Turks, will fight for it. Everything here is now unsettled, the place full of thieves. Not only the Turks, as well as the authorities, are making as much as they can for themselves, so no justice is done, and thieves get off by paying the authorities. And that also is very telling for what also happens. However, what he intends to do, as he ends the entry, is answer letters he has received from England and his children. I'll answer them today and go to Smyrna to post them. Well, I hope he did, because he died 3 weeks later and is buried in the churchyard. As far as I know, soon after that, his wife went to Egypt to be with her sons. But that is what happened to an ordinary man during a war.